Hello y'all, this is Louie and welcome back to Retrosaurus. Today we'll be examining the role of art direction in video games and how it can make even a classic game still look and feel somewhat modern despite its age. Now, there are countless examples of games whose art direction still carries them to this day. Nintendo games in particular tend to have this timeless look due to their cartoonish feel or heavily stylized presentations. Heck, even our last Retrosaurus subject, Haunting Ground, employs a heavily stylized approach to their visuals that can make you question its age. When it comes to video games, strong or weak art direction can make or break a title from enjoying lasting appeal years and decades after release. The transition from 2D to 3D made this a sticking point, as early 3D games tend to look less refined or appealing than older 2D counterparts. It really wasn't until the PlayStation 2 generation that 3D games started to come into their own and develop art styles that would stand the test of time. The transition from PS1 to the PS2 in particular was such a huge leap in technology and graphical fidelity and sound design that game developers had far more freedom to express their visions. The Silent Hill series in particular released its first two titles within a couple years of each other on these platforms and are prime examples of this technological leap. Today, however, we'll be focusing on what I believe is the strongest entry in the Silent Hill franchise in terms of art direction, Silent Hill 3. Now, this isn't to say that other entries in the series don't have strong art directions or even imply that their visuals are ugly. Except, well, Downpour and Homecoming. Then again, art direction is the least offensive aspects of those games. But Silent Hill 3, alongside its asset lender Silent Hill 2, uses every weapon at its disposal from art style, lighting, camera work, sound design, you name it, to create a world whose visuals and atmosphere remain beautifully bleak and unnerving to this day. For our purposes, I'm going to define art direction more broadly than graphics and visuals, as that would unfairly remove complementary aspects such as sound design and player interactivity, as art is more than simply what we see. It's what we feel, what we hear, what we see, and especially what we experience that affects all of us emotionally on a personal level. With those aspects in mind, join me as we step back into the fog and get lost in the other world of Silent Hill. As it is the first time Silent Hill has appeared in this series, guess what we get to do? That's right. So before we get into our main subject, let me give you a brief background on the series. There will be spoilers for these games, as Silent Hill 3 is a direct sequel to the first entry in the series. For the purposes of this video, we will be limiting our scope to the Team Silent produced entries, specifically 1, 2, and 3, but not 4. Never 4. I hate you so much, you terrible piece of shit. The first Silent Hill was released late in the original PlayStation's life cycle on February 23rd, 1999 worldwide, and less than 2 weeks later in Japan on March 4th. This title was the first of 4 main entries to be created and released by the then unnamed Team Silent, may they rest in peace, and the only title to be directed by Toyama Keiichiro, who would later go on to make the Siren and Gravity Rush series. Industry heavy hitters such as art director and creature designer Ito Masahiro and composer Yamaoka Akira began their work on the series with this title, and would go on to have more prominent roles in the team with each game. The first title was envisioned by publisher Konami to be a Hollywood-style horror game that would appeal to Western audiences in a totally not uncharacteristically cynical and profit-oriented approach. Team Silent, known at the time as Konami Computer Entertainment Tokyo, easily rolls off the tongue, doesn't it, was composed of members who, according to an interview with Yamaoka Akira, failed in previous projects. The team was given quite a bit of creative freedom with this, surprisingly, which may have caused their initial difficulties in deciding how to proceed with the game's direction. The game would be set in a typical American town and feature an everyman protagonist to make the game feel more familiar and immersive for players. As development progressed, the game took on a psychological horror approach that employed fear of the unknown and some sci-fi elements to differentiate itself from more visceral and gory horror games at the time, such as Alone in the Dark and Resident Evil. We just can't get away from Capcom, can we, huh? Although most of the games in the series are wholly unrelated narratively, there are shared aspects of the world and lore that are present in nearly every entry. Silent Hill 2 specifically has little to no relation to any of the other titles, being a fairly self-contained narrative. Additionally, Silent Hill 4 does not take place within the town proper, though it does imply strong connections to Dahlia Gillespie and her associated cult from the first title. Unlike those two, Silent Hill 1 and 3 serve as a duology that tells the story of a man named Harry Mason and his daughter Heather, and how their lives and fates are intertwined with the eponymous town. The first game features Harry as the protagonist, a modern-day everyman who awakes after a freak car accident that leaves him stranded in the foggy town of Silent Hill. Shortly after coming to, he realizes his daughter Cheryl is missing and searches the town for her, all while uncovering the truth of her origins and the dark, sinister events that transpired that resulted in her death and subsequent abandonment on the side of the road near town. We come to learn of Cheryl's connection to Dahlia Gillespie and the cult, known simply as the Order, and how they used her daughter Alessa as a sacrifice to revive their dark god. At the end of the game, Alessa releases Harry from the town and entrusts him with the child. Alessa's soul herself reborn and free from the pain she endured. Flash forward 17 years to Silent Hill 3, where the child has grown up and is now known as Heather, our new protagonist. Heather is unaware of her connection to Silent Hill until a private investigator named Douglas pays her a visit, and with that brings quite a bit of bother to her otherwise boring life, ultimately leading her back to Silent Hill to confront her demons. At least, I think this is how it played out. To be honest, the last thing related to either of these games that I've had any contact in with about a year were the movies, Silent Hill and Silent Hill Revelations 3D. Do you remember that last one? Remember when 3D movies were a huge thing, but none of the studios except maybe Disney actually did anything interesting with them? Well, I guess people liked Avatar, not The Last Airbender, but I do stand by that movie being better than anything James Cameron has ever made. Now that I think about it, Revelations had Jonathan Snow from Game of Thrones in it, and that dude couldn't act his way out of a wet paper bag if his life depended on it. Jesus Christ, where the hell was I? As I don't want to spoil everything from Silent Hill 3's story all that much, I'll leave the synopsis at that, but I do encourage everyone to watch both films as they give you a much deeper appreciation for the games, as not even Downpour is as offensively terrible as Revelations 3D. I'm just hecking with you, it's worse, of course it's worse than that movie. In addition to the narrative, players are kept engaged and immersed in the world of Silent Hill due to its art direction. As I mentioned earlier in the video, I am defining this term broadly compared to how people tend to use it, as visuals alone do not carry a game years and decades after release. Every aspect of a game's design is complementary to each other, as no single aspect can lift any game out of mediocrity. I'll be breaking down the game into 4 sensory aspects and give attention to each one, as I feel they're all equally important in understanding how Silent Hill 3 achieves its lasting appeal and effectiveness as a horror game. These sensory aspects are C, the visuals, graphics, art style, etc. Hear, sound design, music, voice work, any audio feedback. Feel, the controls, character movement, combat, and general player interactivity. And experience, narrative and thematic emotional responses, plus characterization. I've mentioned previously in our Haunting Ground-centric episode how ludonarrative dissonance can have an impact on how well a game can be effective in its chosen genre, and this game similarly attempts to marry the gameplay to the narrative themes, but more on that later. Let's get the most obvious sensory aspect out of the way, as it's the easiest to convey. Visually, Silent Hill 3 is still remarkable even 17 years after its release, despite being a mid-life cycle PS2 game. This can be entirely attributed to the visual art direction the developers employed during development. Like its predecessor Silent Hill 2, the art style aims for the middle ground between stylized and realism, where it still resembles a video game while not veering too far into Uncanny Valley territory. The game has 2 distinct worlds that the players explore: the real world and the other world. The real world is the, well, normal world your everyday person would inhabit. We are introduced to this one shortly after the prologue when Heather awakens in a diner. In this portion of the intro, you do see other humans and NPCs, albeit very briefly, but soon after you are handed over control of Heather, they are nowhere to be seen. Upon arriving in the town of Silent Hill, it resembles the fog world of Silent Hill 2 more, with a dense fog blanketing it, with enemies roaming around. Although it is supposedly real, it still carries an eeriness to it, as stores, pathways, and streets are devoid of any other human life or otherwise, save for Heather. Even when things are intended to be innocuous or familiar, the atmosphere remains heavy and worrying, as you can easily find yourself in the other world. Nearly every location in the game features an alternate, disturbing version of itself to differentiate itself from its real-world counterpart. The otherworld typically manifests itself with bloodied walls, rusted exposed metal, and decay both organic and inorganic in nature. This is where much of the combat and exploration takes place, though you do quite a bit of exploration in the real world as well. Enemies spawn and roam the empty streets and halls of the town, with each enemy having a symbolic relation to the narrative and lore of Alessa. The otherworld is present in every entry of the Silent Hill series, but honestly, the most gruesome, visceral interpretation comes from this game. The monsters that reside in this version of the world are disturbing in all facets of their existence. Their designs are creepy, and the way they move and their mannerisms while attacking Heather can make anyone uncomfortable. The stark difference between these two worlds is easily one of the most memorable aspects of Silent Hill in general. While most other horror series typically stay within one location or one dimension, Silent Hill takes what is an otherwise normal setting and peels back the skin to unveil a hidden horrific reality that hides beneath. As the worlds shift and change throughout the story, doors and pathways may become locked or uncovered, forcing you to take in all of your surroundings and commit them to memory, as they can easily blend and merge in your mind. Our second sensory aspect is hear, or in a more defined term, sound design. Sound design in a video game is any auditory feedback the player experiences. In the case of Silent Hill, sound design is easily one of the most effective sensory aspects in terms of creating the perfect atmosphere, as well as one of its unique contributions to the genre. The way sound is used in Silent Hill is different from most other horror games, heck even most other games in general. Unlike games like Resident Evil, Clock Tower, or Fatal Frame, the way ambient noise, silence, and music is so masterfully implemented gives life to an otherwise violent and decaying world. The sound of Silent Hill is such a unique aspect of the game, as most of the music is not, well, typical music. Sure, we have vocal and instrumental themes at the beginning and end of the game, and naturally they also accompany important scenes and character interactions. But the biggest contribution comes from the combination of ambient noise and silence. Much of the music in the series is composed of combinations of non-instrumental sounds and noises that create an unnerving soundscape. Each area has its own theme of sorts, with the real world opting for more silence polluted with growls and snarls of vicious animals looking to sink their teeth into Heather despite not being able to see them a lot of the time. It's not uncommon to hear things such as heavy crashes or striking metal, accompanied by moans and groans of enemies, giving each hallway and area its own flavor and personality. And some of the noises the monsters make, such as the Slurper for example, which makes this ungodly noise which I can only describe as the sound of loud crunching bones in its teeth. It gives me the heebie-jeebies just thinking about it. Each monster has a unique set of sounds, some are more clear than others and resemble the cries of children and babies when killed. With all the violent and horrific sounds that you encounter in the game, the most unnerving thing you may hear just might be pure, untainted silence. There are many times throughout your playthrough where you are simply left to wander in an empty, darkened area with only the sounds of Heather's footsteps echoing throughout the space. These areas can either bring you a moment's reprieve or fill you with a sense of anxiety that soon enough, you will encounter something far scarier and more menacing than in the area you just left. Now onto one of my favorite aspects of gaming, feel, aka player interactivity. Now, I'm going to preface this by mentioning I would never rank Silent Hill very high in terms of control fluidity and general accessibility. However, the games are relatively easy to pick up from a control perspective, and plenty of feedback is given visually and audibly to the player. Additionally, the vibration function of the DualShock 2 and the pressure-sensitive buttons do allow for additional combat-related feedback, so you feel a certain weight to the character movements. It's an odd thing to point out, but there are some games where you just don't feel like you're actually doing anything. Dark Souls especially comes to mind when I think of games where I don't feel like I'm playing anything. The default controls for the first 3 entries in the series are your standard tank controls. However, I do enjoy these controls as I am a total nostalgia-driven sucker for tank-controlled games. I love tank controls with every fiber of my being. As Silent Hill employs semi-fixed camera angles in its presentation, tank controls make the most sense in terms of implementation, at least in my opinion. However, starting with Silent Hill 2, players are able to choose between 2D, which is directional, or 3D, which is tank-style, control schemes, to best fit their playstyle. Additionally, I don't think one or the other is better in terms of controllability, as movement and combat play out relatively easily, though 2D controls do give you more maneuverability and control in exchange for slight disorientation when the camera angles change. Giving players options while retaining a similar feel for each is not an easy task to pull off, but somehow they kind of nailed it. That being said, the combat leaves much to be desired. Unlike its direct PS2 predecessor, combat is thrust into the spotlight despite not being, well, very good. Enemies are faster and have ways of stun locking you or knocking you over, even though you try to shoot at them, but the auto aim just wasn't having it that day, so it shot directly over their stupid heads since they're just scurrying around on the floor like some stupid lobster man hybrid, and Heather just lies there motionless like the last piece of Kerrygold buttered bread my girlfriend dropped butter side down on the floor and nearly started crying over. I know this particular enemy and knockdown are supposed to be symbolic of something far more serious, but it would be nice if a female character in a horror game didn't have to have allusions to sexual assault to reinforce outdated sexist tropes that a woman needed to be violated to highlight their vulnerability. Just saying, it's still a thing in modern games and it's not limited to only Japanese created games, but it tends to show up more in them. Back to a more lighthearted note, one thing Silent Hill 2 and 3 do that other entries in the series, in addition to many other games do, is the ability to customize your playthrough with multiple difficulty options. For some, Silent Hill is about the puzzles, while others are there for the survival horror combat, and even more is simply there for the story. The game breaks down difficulty into combat and riddle difficulties, with multiple selections for each so you can tailor the game to your needs and taste to experience the game however you'd like. Now this has become more common as of late, with games such as Bravely Default on the 3DS allowing you to adjust elements like EXP and encounters to make your playthrough easy or as challenging as you'd like. This goes hand in hand with the customizable control schemes to make the games more inviting to casual or new players without sacrificing anything for veteran fans. This may seem trivial, but go back to some older PS2 games with rigid, archaic gameplay design and wonder what a skosh of player customization could do to make it more accessible over a decade later. Now, our last aspect, experience, is a combination of all three previous sensory aspects and the narrative, and ultimately their effectiveness on the player. Each of the previous aspects, see, hear, and feel, will greatly differ in effectiveness from person to person, especially if other factors come into play that may affect your sight, hearing, motor functions, or etc. I touched a bit on the narrative of the game, but for a quick spoiler-ridden recap, the story follows Heather Mason, the reborn soul of Alessa Gillespie, as she is forced to return to the town of Silent Hill to uncover her true origins and stop the Order from summoning their god. The game features one of the few female leads in the horror genre who surprisingly acts like a real person instead of a generic two-dimensional character that seems to plague video games then and now. It's especially notable as Heather is the only female playable character in the main series Silent Hill games. There might be one in a spin-off or a Japan-only mobile game, but honestly I don't really think it counts if something is limited to a severely limited platform. An article from Destructoid about 4 or 5 years ago by Stephen Turner addresses the themes of coming of age and viciousness that are weaved into the narrative and gameplay of the game. At 17 years of age, Heather looks and acts the part of a teenager who is struggling to find her place in the world and distance herself from her past. She is a unique, more identifiable character compared to the other Silent Hill protagonists, who are mostly just generic white men in their 20s and 30s who don't all get the same amount of depth and attention as her. Making the character more relatable makes it easier for players to sympathize with her struggles and feel more real than her counterparts. The small cast of about 4 or 5 characters makes the game more intimate, allowing fewer characters to have more screen time and making more of an emotional impact. Speaking of the cast, the voice cast of the game perfectly complements the writing and narrative in a way that modern games would most likely be unable to achieve. I am a huge stickler when it comes to voice acting, and I tend to lean towards the side of disliking commonly heard or established voices in video games. This means I find it hard to be immersed in a game that uses the same top 10 voice actors you hear in every video game or animated media. I mean, who really needs to hear Troy Baker and Laura Bailey again? This is important to note, in my opinion, as the HD collection for this series completely replaces the voice acting for Silent Hill 2 and 3 and replaces them with more recognizable names who are popular within the English voice acting industry. Additionally, the HD collection was cobbled together from incomplete code from their respective games, so the master copies of the games we all know and love have been lost because of Konami or someone at the office not doing their job. As the code is incomplete in these versions, things such as sounds, textures, and voice acting are missing or replaced, which makes it more inferior than the original releases. Which is sad because as time goes on, those original PS2 games are looking muddier and harder to display properly in high definition TV. Heck, even the video for this, when I was recording it, it was really hard to get the picture to look really sharp without sacrificing some quality or some color because the conversion from standard def to HD is not very good or well programmed into the PS2 itself. It only serves to highlight what may seem like small, minute additions that ultimately were important pieces of the puzzle that the developers envisioned. Now for me, this game is far from my favorite in the series, though it does hold a special place in my heart. Full disclosure, I personally didn't play any of the Silent Hill games until about a couple years ago, so I don't feel held back by nostalgia for these games, especially this one, when it comes to how timeless I find the game to be even now. Despite its slightly aged visuals and controls, the overall package still manages to be an incredibly effective horror game, even compared to more modern sequels and rival series. I think one thing that helps this series remain somewhat relevant and timeless in design is the fact there hasn't been a new entry in the series in over 8 years, with Downpour being the last, in 16 years since the original development team has worked on the series. Starting with Origins, development was moved over to the West and shifted between several different developers over time. And I personally don't think any of the Western developed games have really aged all that well comparatively, as they didn't really have good art direction or understanding of why the first 3 games were so effective at what they did. You'll never find another series like Silent Hill. Very few games have been able to pull off quite the same or even a similar feel and presentation and design that keeps the series from completely falling into obscurity. Another thing that keeps the original releases of these relevant is the fact the HD collection failed to recapture the art direction of the originals and failed spectacularly at putting care and love into one of the most important franchises in video games. As the years go on, these games will become more scarce with wear and tear and disc rot slowly decaying the few copies left in circulation. As we have no modern way of playing these games, all we have is the HD collection to look back to give to future generations to understand and experience these games, but unfortunately they will not have the same experience as we did. At the very least, we do have 2 PC versions of 2 and 3 that modders are slowly working on to bring modern enhancements to keep the games more accessible and relevant to people, as they are abandonware and they're easy to find on the internet. I will not be linking to them, but you can just do a Google search for yourself. I'm pretty sure you can figure that out. With this in mind, as the years go on, one thing will remain certain. The art direction of Silent Hill 3 will continue to solidify its place in gaming history as a must-experience title. My only hope is that future generations will discover these titles and understand what made them so special for us and keep them from being completely lost to time. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Retrosaurus. Sorry for it being so late compared to the last episode, but you know, life gets in the way, tech issues happen. But I really enjoyed working on this one. I really hope you enjoyed watching it. Now, if you're new, make sure to hit that subscribe button to keep up to date with more episodes of Retrosaurus and its sister series, Podosaurus, which is available on Simplecast, iTunes, Google Play, and Spotify. Now, if you really enjoyed it, a thumbs up and a comment let me know what you guys like so I can continue to make the best videos possible for y'all. And if you'd like to support the series in a more direct way, you can do so on Patreon. There's a link in the description, or you can search the website for KyoryuHunter and you'll find me quite easily. In addition to that, you can find me on all social media, including Twitch, YouTube, Twitter, and even MySpace at KyoryuHunter, which is easier to spell than it is to say. And with that, my name is Lou. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time on Retrosaurus.